Hi, my name is Raven Burns Kushner. I am a fine art painter and a life coach specializing in therapeutic art therapy and holistic health. I wanted to come on here because even though I am a spiritual practitioner, long-term meditator, I've been practicing spiritual practices for many, many years and am considered adept at it. I lost sleep the other day, a couple nights ago, after seeing the clips of our president interacting with the president of the Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, who, by the way, Mr. Zelensky, kudos to him for maintaining his cool, his calm, his masculine energy. That's really the example of what it's like, in my opinion, to truly be in your masculine energy. There's been a weird sort of fetishization of masculine, and people are looking at someone who's narcissistic and bombastic, as Trump is, as some sort of signal of masculinity, but that really isn't. That's someone who doesn't really feel confident in their abilities. Whereas the type of energy that Mr. Zelensky was producing, he came in there with a mission. His mission is to protect his people and to end the war that's destroying his people. And I'm sure he must have suspected that the United States, our current leadership is probably not going to be helpful, but he owed it to his people to go ahead and come over here and have the interview. And of course, it was a disaster. It was an embarrassment. And it really gave us an idea of what we can expect going forward. And I think as Black people, we already know. We are not surprised. But I think what is surprising is the cruelty that the majority culture is showing towards each other. I also had seen just previously that clip of the woman who was, I think all she said was, "Women are dying," which they are, in response to some of the misogynistic laws that are now going through. And, she was dragged out and treated really poorly. And it really gave this sort of vision of what we can expect. The leadership is unhinged. It's not based on any kind of morality or decency or even democracy. So it got me to thinking about my inspiration as an artist. I am descended from Mr. Junius George Groves, who was a multimillionaire entrepreneur farmer in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he made his money, obviously, in a time where it was near impossible to even be employed, let alone, make that kind of money as an entrepreneur. But there were a series of people, a group of people known as the Black aristocrats, who were able to make that happen. They owned their homes, they owned their businesses, many of them. They had prestigious jobs, they had education, they had manners, they had culture during a time where, and they started really when slavery was still intact. Now, yes, they did have privilege. Many of them were descended from parents who were slave owners, who loved them and who gave them advantages, gave them inheritances when they died, and so on and so forth. And of course, they had light skin privilege, many of them, because they were descendants of these people. And not in all cases, but in many cases, that was the case. And some of them were immigrants from other places, so they didn't have they weren't former slaves at all. Nevertheless, I think we can look towards them as examples of how to carry forward, because their situation was even more dire than our situation. Although that's debatable, because at least they had a solid democracy, whereas who knows what's coming. We have a president who's in love with dictatorship and fascism, so we don't really know what's coming. But what we do know is that the only people we really have control over is ourselves. I only have control over myself. I don't have control over, what anyone else does. I did my duty and voted. That's all I can do. But I think moving forward as a people, there's a lot of things I think that we can learn from the Black aristocrats of the early 20th century. And I just wanted to share some of the stuff that I learned, because when I started doing my series on Black aristocrats, my painting series, I was studying and reading about them and fascinated, because we really aren't taught much about them, and I think it's because it was a very positive representation, and our nation seems hell-bent on having us believe, and not even just us, women, everybody. We're all supposed to see ourselves as lesser than, as lower than, because that's the only way we'll buy stuff is if we don't think we are enough as we are. So we don't have to fall for that, right? We have examples that we can look to show us that we are not lower than, we are not lesser than. We get to create our own identity, because the identity that's trying to be foisted upon us works in their behalf, not our behalf. So anyone who's trying to convince you that you are, meant to be broke, meant to struggle, meant to be discriminated against, meant to always be, struggling against something, you don't have to accept that as fact. You can patently reject that as false. So one of the things, there's 5 things I wanted to go over that I learned, at least, and there's many more lessons than 5, but I want to narrow it down to 5 lessons that I learned from Black aristocrats that I think we can adopt going forward in our situation. One of them is that the Black aristocrats really stuck together. There were a handful of families that were known for being respectable, having education, having political ties, and they did things as a group. They socialized together, they intermarried together, they had parties, they threw philanthropic events together, they vacationed together. It was very important to them to have that unified front, because they knew that they were a minority within a minority. They were often rejected by the larger Black community because they were perceived as snobs, as, oh, you think you're white. And, that kind of mentality continues on. And I personally don't think that we can afford to have that kind of mentality going forward. We're going to have to present a unified front as much as possible. It doesn't mean we have to always agree with each other, because that's impossible, but it does mean that we have to know that we're all in the same boat, and not to put even more false divisions between us as a people. So one of the things is unity. We're going to have to, if you disagree with, and there's plenty of Black talking heads that say crazy things that are not legitimate, and they're allowed, this is a free country still for now, so they're allowed to do whatever they want. And I certainly don't have to agree with it or, work together with people like that. Nevertheless, I will not publicly criticize them either, because there's no need to. As I said before, the only person I can control is myself, and I'm focused on that. Number 2, one of the things that I think really gave the Black aristocrats of that time period an advantage is that they had pride in their background. They were not ashamed of who they were. And yes, they were advantaged, but not all of them were. Some of them had to learn how to read, had to learn how to have manners and culture. They weren't all, recipients of inheritances and things like that. So, and some of them, they were put down for being biracial and multiracial because, the majority Black culture looked at them with suspicion because they had mixed race heritage. And they just decided to have pride in that, to not see it as something to be ashamed of, but to see it as something to be proud of. And of course, they were criticized for that too, because why are you so proud of, say, your Dutch ancestors? Why aren't you just proud of your African ancestors? But they were proud of both. And so they didn't allow anyone else to tell them who they were. They were self-identifying, and they identified as Black people. They didn't actually, go around calling themselves mixed, but they knew what their heritage was, and they were proud of it. They looked at the bright side of having that heritage, and I think that's something that we can do, whatever your heritage and background is. And even if you don't know, which, we were robbed of our heritage, what we can do is just be proud of whoever we came from. Even if we had a dysfunctional home, there's lessons that you absolutely learn from that background. And rather than dwelling on the negativity involved with it, you can decide that all of that stuff made you who you are, that you are the beginning of a sentence that God wants you to finish, that God started the sentence in you and wants you to finish that sentence. And so you can look at it that way. Whatever your background is, be effing proud of it. The third thing that I wanted to share about the Black aristocrats is that they absolutely valued culture over money. Now, they did have money, okay, let's be clear. And they valued having nice things and making a high income, as well they should. We're living in a capitalistic society, and having the baubles of capitalism gives you influence and gives you options and gives you freedom of a sort. And so they understood that, but they valued culture and education more than money itself. In fact, people that wanted to buy into kind of their social group, because they had a lot of influence. The Black aristocrats had the ear of, the presidents that were, presiding at that time. They had influence socially because of their background, because of their respectability, and so on and so forth. But they valued education and refinement and manners and dignity more than money. There were people who wanted to buy into their social group, to have that, to kind of rub shoulders with that influence. And a lot of people were rejected, even if they had money, because they didn't want people who just had money. It was very important that you had something else, that you had culture and that you had refinement and that you spoke properly and that you carried yourself with refinement. That's how you got into the social group, in addition to having, something like either, maybe you had a Pulitzer Prize, or you had accolades in your field, or you had, respectability in your background, even if you didn't have money. So it was a kind of a mixed bag, but you can kind of think of them as like old money, white people, really, because that's kind of how they conduct themselves. They make that distinction between new money and old money. New money is suspect. It's not enough to just have money. You have to also have the character and the refinement that come with, generations of privilege. The fourth thing that the Black aristocrats were really good about is using their money and their privilege for the betterment of the race as a whole. So even though they were routinely ridiculed and rejected by the majority Black culture because they were considered, oh, you guys think you're white, you guys are uppity, you guys are snobs, so on and so forth. But the reality is that a lot of the progress that was made was financed by Black aristocrats. They're the ones that established the first kindergartens because it was perceived that working people are at a disadvantage because their kids have to go, to either babysitters or family that maybe is also uneducated, and they're not getting that head start that is required to move on in life. And so, having a kindergarten, that was a new thing. So it was, and I'll get the name and maybe do a piece on her, a video on her, but there was a Black woman of that class who it was her mission to establish kindergartens. And it ended up being something that was adopted by one of the first ladies, and it was propagated and spread, and it became a common thing, and it was privately funded by her for a long time. So they believed in using their money philanthropically. It was very important to not just buy stuff, but to use that money to have, balls and banquets and charitable organizations and charitable events and fundraisers and things like that to promote the race as a whole. Because even though they may not have socialized with the average Black person, they did believe that a rising tide carries all boats. So if our reputation as a people is elevated, in general, then that is only going to benefit all of us. So I think going forward, we're going to have to use our money very strategically, and not necessarily being out in the streets protesting, but I think working quietly is more to our advantage than being loud, if I'm honest, because white envy is a consequence of, bettering yourself. It's happened with Black Wall Street. It happened with Jim Crow. And that Jim Crow laws really affected the Black aristocrats because they had actually more freedom before, they were kind of seen as sort of like a separate class of people, and they were kind of just left alone for the most part. But when Jim Crow was established, they were kind of thrown into the same boat as all black people, and it didn't matter how little black blood they even had. It's like if that one drop rule was used to oppress as many people as possible. So the idea is that we're going to have to use our money strategically and quietly, because there is a backlash. And I think personally that this whole Trump fascist era was caused in part by the backlash of envious white people when they saw the Obamas and saw a strong black marriage and saw healthy black children and privileged black people who spoke correctly, who were proud of themselves, who had self-esteem, who were able to accomplish things that previous presidents were not. All of that, you can't underestimate the power of envy in people that feel that they deserve all of the accolades, that they deserve all of the privilege and all the rights. And so it's very important, I think, to use your money strategically to move causes that you believe in forward, to be financially stable, and also to do it very quietly, because you don't want to cause unnecessary attention that you don't need to. The last thing that I wanted to share that the Black aristocrats were good at is they refused to succumb to their circumstances. So when they were blocked by the bigotry and the racism, and they saw the racism increase under Jim Crow, they found ways around it. So one of the things that they did was when hotels, when they started really enforcing restrictions and not allowing black people to stay, even at hotels that they could easily afford, because, they were privileged enough that they could stay at any hotel they wanted to. But rather than go out there and face the indignity of being told, oh no, you have to go to crappy hotels because you're black, they're like, no, they use their network. And instead of going to hotels at all, they kind of had a network going where they had ties to, like, black people in Washington, D.C., had ties to black people in Virginia, and ties to black people in the South, and so they had their sort of elite network across America. So when they would travel, they just sort of sent word to the network, and they opened their homes to each other. And rather than suffer the indignity of having to stay in some crappy hotel and allow the society to label them as lesser than, they're like, no, we're just going to do something else. We're going to still have proper accommodations. We're going to have proper treatment. We're going to enjoy ourselves. We're going to enjoy our vacations. And when they would go on vacations, they bought up land and they vacationed together. And, they're like, segregation in a sense worked for them because they didn't see it as, and they didn't want to be around racist white people. That wasn't the goal. Even though kind of the majority black people would sometimes accuse them of wanting to be white, that isn't what they actually wanted. They liked their little group of black people who were refined and privileged and, educated and kind and helpful. And so they did everything together. And I think that we can do that. We can be better at using our networks, and rather than relying on, crossing our fingers and hoping that the powers that be do the right thing, which is, in my opinion, a complete waste of time, we need to be better at what's our network, and I think we're going to start seeing more organizations, organizing connections in various parts of the country to where, how do we support each other? How do we opt out of the system altogether and support one another? We do not have to accept the labels that are being thrust upon us at all. And while we have the freedoms that we do have, let's use them strategically and not wait and not hope and not cross our fingers. That is not a plan, right? I think more than ever, we're going to have a plan, and we're going to have to let go of some of the things that we've been clinging to, some of the laziness, some of the just accepting, the low-level mindset that we've adopted. We're going to have to not be consumers, but be producers, so on and so forth. So I'll probably talk more about this mindset going forward, because I see that it's one of those things that we don't want to be inundated by the news and the media and things, but we also don't want to bury our heads in the sand. So I'm all about solutions. So let's be people of solutions. Let's be people that define ourselves, and let's create the world that we know that we're worthy of going forward. So I hope that you found this little talk helpful, and I hope you'll come back. Check out my website, ravenkushner.com, so you can see examples of my art. My art focuses on the upper class of the Black community, as well as beauty in general. And my life coaching, I focus on therapeutic art and also holistic health. So this is a time where self-care is more important than it's ever been, and it's no longer optional. It's absolutely required that we be of sound mind and body going forward. So I hope to see you next time, and have a beautiful day. Thank you for watching.